India once stood shoulder to shoulder with Palestine, a champion of anti-colonial solidarity and non-alignment. It was the first non-Arab state to recognize the PLO in 1974 and among the earliest to recognize the state of Palestine in 1988. Yet, in 2025, as bombs flatten Gaza and 147 nations line up to recognize Palestine at the United Nations this year, New Delhi's voice has grown quieter, measured, hedged, and abstaining. The moral compass of the global South now seems calibrated to arms deals, investment pacts, and Washington's gaze. India calls for dialogue, but stops short of naming atrocity. How long can this balancing act last before it collapses under its own contradictions? And will India finally speak up against Israeli brutality? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. The world is shifting. France, Australia, Canada, and even parts of the UK establishment are preparing formal recognition of Palestine at the 2025 UNGA, which is underway. Pakistan, China, Russia, and much of the Arab world already vote 100% pro-Palestine despite US pressure. Yet India, once Palestine's loudest friend outside the Arab bloc, has abstained 4 times on Gaza ceasefire votes in 2 years. Modi visited Tel Aviv without Ramallah in 2017, then staged a separate balancing visit to Ramallah in 2018. In the face of mounting civilian deaths and war crime accusations, how much abstention is too much before India's credibility as voice of the global South snaps? India's early Palestine policy was forged in the fire of anti-colonial struggle. In 1947, New Delhi opposed the UN partition plan for Palestine and voted against Israel's admission to the United Nations, aligning with the Arab bloc. In 1974, India became the first non-Arab state to recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, allowing it to open an office in New Delhi the following year.
We are of one mind in our support for the brave, homeless, and much harassed Palestinian people. Israel feels free to commit any outrage, unabashed in its aggression, unrepentant about its transgressions of international law and behavior. But can it forever obstruct the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people?
By 1988, India was among the first countries to recognize the state of Palestine itself, granting embassy status and full state protocol to the PLO leadership.
In 1988, India became one of the first countries to recognize the state of Palestine with firm support and commitment to the two-state solution. I am pleased to underscore that India led by example in this regard more than 37 years ago.
Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Indian diplomats routinely spoke of Palestinian self-determination and statehood as a moral imperative. This record built India's credibility in the Arab world and underpinned its self-image as a leader of the non-aligned movement. But it also created expectations that India would not just vote but lead when the chips were down. Those expectations now collide with the transformed strategic environment, one where defense tech, counterterrorism, and US goodwill weigh heavily on New Delhi's calculus. The turning point came with dehyphenation. In 1992, India established full diplomatic relations with Israel while keeping its Palestine ties intact. By Modi's era, that balancing act became explicit choreography. In July 2017, Modi landed in Tel Aviv for a first-ever standalone visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Israel. No detour to Ramallah, no joint photo ops with Palestinian leaders, just a high-octane showcase of defense contracts, agricultural innovation, and diaspora rallies with Netanyahu. The symbolism was unmistakable. India would engage Israel on its own merits, unlinked to Palestine. And then, a year later, in February 2018, Prime Minister Modi made a separate, dramatic helicopter trip to Ramallah, circumventing Israel completely. The first such standalone visit to the Palestinian territories by an Indian Prime Minister, pledging aid and reiterating support for a two-state solution. This sequencing looked like balance but functioned as compartmentalization. It told the world that India's Palestine policy had shifted from passionate solidarity to managed symbolism. That shift now frames every abstention and every muted statement on Gaza. Ever since Israel started its crusade against Gaza in 2023, it has turned India's balancing act into a stress test. As civilian casualties soared and international organizations accused Israel of war crimes, the United Nations General Assembly tabled a resolution demanding an immediate, unconditional ceasefire, release of hostages, and humanitarian access. India abstained, its fourth such abstention on major Gaza votes since 2023. Officially, India still supports a negotiated two-state solution and condemns civilian deaths, but it avoids naming Israel as the perpetrator, preferring symmetrical calls for restraint by all parties. Critics call this moral evasion. India, they note, stood alone amongst South Asians, BRICS, and the SCO members, isolated while the rest of the global South voted yes. Supporters say New Delhi is being pragmatic, protecting vital defense ties and US goodwill. Yet each abstention chips away at the credibility India built over decades as Palestine's friend. The question lingers, is New Delhi's policy still balanced, or has it tipped into complicity? Israel's Gaza offensive has produced images too stark to ignore. Flattened hospitals, mass graves, displaced families. Global trade unions, civil society groups, and even Western governments now frame recognizing Palestine as correcting a historic imbalance. India issues carefully worded statements, deep concern, simply unacceptable, but avoids stronger terms like atrocity or even genocide. It does, as it should, however, condemn Hamas's October 7, 2023 attack as terrorism, reflecting its zero-tolerance line on terror. This symmetry might satisfy the letter of diplomacy, but it clashes with the scale of devastation in Gaza. For many in Indian civil society, the government's abstention crosses a moral red line. Pro-Palestine protests at home face police restrictions, intensifying the perception that humanitarian advocacy is being subordinated to strategic caution. India's once automatic moral authority on Palestine is fraying under the weight of realpolitik. While India calibrates, the world accelerates. Over 147 UN members now recognize Palestine, with France, Australia, Canada, and even parts of the UK preparing formal recognition this year. China, Russia, Ireland, Norway, Spain all vote for Palestine on key resolutions despite varying levels of cooperation with Israel. Even states that maintain quiet security ties with Tel Aviv publicly back Palestine at the United Nations. Pakistan, for instance, its voting record is 100% pro-Palestine, zero abstentions, despite occasional covert intelligence contacts with Israel and ongoing US pressure. The message? Geopolitics may complicate but does not excuse silence. India, once a pioneer of Palestine's cause, now risks becoming an outlier, neither joining the pro-Palestine consensus nor offering an alternative vision for peace. India's strategic embrace of Israel is overt and growing, especially in defense, agriculture, and high-tech sectors. Add to this Washington's heavy hand at the UN, pressing allies to abstain rather than back resolutions critical of Israel. New Delhi also weighs domestic politics, rising Hindu nationalist rhetoric, a desire not to be branded Islamist or anti-Israel, and the optics of aligning with Pakistan on any vote. Yet these factors cannot erase the perception gap. If Pakistan, China, and much of Europe can defy US pressure to vote for Palestine, why can't India, the self-styled voice of the global South? India's balancing act carries costs. Each abstention fuels accusations of hypocrisy. Championing democracy and human rights in principle ducking them in practice. It undermines New Delhi's bid to lead the global south, erodes trust in Arab capitals, and hands rhetorical ammunition to rivals. Internationally, it risks casting India not as a bridge but as a bystander, especially as Israel doubles down on rejecting a Palestinian state outright. Strategic interests with Israel are real, but so are reputational stakes with 147 pro-Palestine nations. How much is too much? May not be a slogan, but a strategic threshold. Cross it, and India's hard-earned moral capital could evaporate. India still has options. It can continue abstaining, hoping its statements of deep concern will suffice, or it can recalibrate, using its ties with Israel to press for ceasefire compliance, humanitarian access, and concrete movement toward a two-state solution. It can match words with votes, signaling that friendship with Israel does not mean carte blanche. This would not erase strategic cooperation, but would restore credibility among partners who see Palestine as a litmus test of justice. Prime Minister Modi's separate visits to Tel Aviv and Ramallah proved India can choreograph symbolism. The next test is substance, whether New Delhi will speak up at the United Nations and beyond, even at some diplomatic cost. The world is recognizing Palestine. Will India? India's position on Palestine has shifted from principle-driven solidarity to a calculated ambiguity, dehyphenation in policy and abstention at the United Nations. History is clear. From opposing the 1947 partition to recognizing the PLO in 1974, Palestine in 1988, and supporting key UN votes through 2012, India once stood as a pillar of Palestinian self-determination. And Prime Minister Modi's separate visits to Tel Aviv and Ramallah embodied a new strategy which was a masterstroke. Parallel tracks, compartmentalization, yet emphasizing that both Palestine and Israel are important to New Delhi. But as Gaza burns and 147 nations line up for Palestine, that strategy now faces its harshest test. India's realpolitik, defense deals, US pressure, domestic optics explains the abstentions but does not absolve them. The threshold for global and moral criticism is rising fast. If India continues fence-sitting, it risks squandering decades of goodwill and the very leadership it claims in the global south. If it speaks up, it may irritate powerful friends but regain a moral voice. The question is no longer whether India supports a two-state solution in words, but whether it will act, vote, pressure, and lead when it matters. How much is too much? The answer may define India's place in the world for years to come. Thank you for watching Statecraft.